The plastic cracked under my father's boot with a sound like a small bone giving up. It happened at the gate under the harsh white floodlights of Naval Base Coronado, with the ocean air wet on my tongue and exhaust hanging in the cold like breath you couldn't take back. My Rear Admiral ID, gray, unremarkable, the kind of card you never flaunted, skittered across the concrete and stopped beside a crushed Mountain Dew can. Frank Riley looked down at it the way men looked at something embarrassing on their shoe. "Hide that," he said. 2 words. Command, not care. I stood on the other side of the gate line with my hands still on the steering wheel, knuckles pale but steady. The guard's booth window reflected my face back at me. Quiet, composed, a woman who'd learned to keep her expression locked even when her ribs wanted to split. Behind my father, my mother held her rosary so tight, the beads pressed dense into her palm. Her lips moved without sound, as if prayer could cushion impact. My younger brother's graduation pass sat on the dashboard, printed in cheerful font. Naval Special Warfare SEAL Graduation. Family Day. A happy day. A day I'd promised myself I would not fracture. The gate sentry, young, fit, watchful, glanced at my father, then at me, then down to the ID on the ground. His posture twitched with the reflex to salute, like muscle memory trying to do the right thing. I met his eyes for half a beat and gave him the smallest headshake. "Don't!" He swallowed the motion like it burned and stepped back into procedure. "Morning," he said, voice neutral. "IDs, please." Frank shoved his own card forward with a little flourish, as if service only counted when it made noise. "Hups. Here," he said. "My son's becoming a SEAL." 7 words, pride sharp enough to cut. The sentry nodded politely and scanned it. The scanner beeped. The gate arm stayed down. "I need the driver's ID," the sentry said. My father didn't move. He leaned closer to the booth window like he owned it. "She's driving," he said, jerking his thumb back at me without looking. "Just a guest." 5 words. A dismissal dressed like logistics. The sentry's gaze returned to me, careful now. "Ma'am?" I reached for my wallet by habit, already knowing what was inside and what it could do to this moment. I didn't want power today. I wanted peace. My father's hand shot across the console, fast, practiced. He snatched the wallet out of my grip and flipped it open like he was proving a point. His fingers found the ID instantly, like he'd rehearsed stealing my identity for years. He held it up, read the top line, and his face tightened. Then he tossed it out the window. It hit the concrete and slid. And then he stepped on it. The sentry's eyes widened, a flash of disbelief that died behind training. My mother made a tiny sound, half breath, half prayer, then crushed it into silence. Frank kept his boot planted like he wanted the concrete to witness him. "She's not showing off," he said. "Not today." 6 words. As if my life was a costume I wore to steal attention from the real men. The wet wind off the bay moved through the open window, smelling like salt and kelp and diesel from the pier. I tasted it sharp and clean and forced my lungs to match it, in, out steady. I lowered my gaze to the ID under his boot and felt something old and familiar tighten behind my sternum. Not rage, not surprise. Recognition. Frank didn't hate me. Frank hated what my existence did to his ego. He worshipped mud-on-boots heroism because it made him feel tall. My work was quiet, classified, clean on the outside. It didn't let him brag at diners. It didn't let him be the loudest man in the room, so he shrank it. He shrank me. "Frank," my mother whispered, rosary beads clicking softly. "Please." 1 word. Begging. He didn't look at her. "Mary," he said, voice flat. "Let it go." 3 words. A muzzle. The sentry cleared his throat and I could hear the discomfort in it. "Ma'am, I have a civilian license," I said, cutting in gently. 6 words. Calm. Frank's head snapped toward me. His eyes were hard, but there was fear under it. The fear that the world would see what he'd been trying to keep small. "You don't need that badge," he hissed. "You dropped out." 6 words. The lie he fed himself like vitamins. I didn't correct him. Not here. Not at the gate. Not with my mother's rosary trembling and my brother's day waiting beyond the arm. I reached into my purse and produced my civilian license. My hand was steady because my hands had signed orders that moved ships and lives. I could handle one insecure old man. The sentry took it, scanned it, and handed it back without meeting my eyes. The gate arm lifted with a mechanical whine. Frank finally moved his boot. My ID lay there, scuffed, dirty, the corner bent like a small injury. I stepped out of the car slowly and crouched beside it. The concrete was cold through my slacks. The smell of wet asphalt and ocean salt mixed in my nose. I picked up the ID. Dirt smeared across the seal. A streak of black rubber cut through my name. I wiped it with my thumb until the plastic warmed under my skin. I didn't wipe it clean, just enough to make it recognizable again, just enough to remind myself it was real. Then I slid it into my pocket like I was burying a body. A funeral for my own identity. Frank climbed back into the passenger seat with a satisfied exhale, like he'd just won something. "Now," he said, "let's go celebrate a warrior." 7 words, a sermon. I got back behind the wheel and drove us onto base. Coronado opened up in front of us, palms swaying, low buildings painted in tidy whites, the bay glittering under a thin sun. The road smelled like eucalyptus and ocean. I could see ships in the distance, gray silhouettes against the horizon. And I knew some of them the way you knew coworkers, by capability, by mission, by the quiet weight they carried. Frank didn't look at the water. He looked at the signs, the flags, the uniforms passing by, and puffed his chest like he belonged to the whole scene. He started talking before we'd even parked. "Teddy Roosevelt said it," he declared, voice booming in the car. "Man in the arena." 6 words. He always quoted men to feel bigger. My mother's fingers moved over her beads, click, 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 like she was counting down to the end of this day. Frank continued, warming up. "Caleb's in the arena, bleeding, risking." 8 words. Still within his worship. He glanced at me a sideways blade. "You're the critic." 3 words, the insult he loved most because it made my service sound like a comment section. I kept my eyes on the road. "I'm his sister," I said. 4 words, a fact he couldn't erase. Frank snorted. "You're a quitter." 3 words, small, cruel. My hands tightened once on the wheel, then relaxed. I'd spent years learning the difference between a threat and a noise. Frank was noise. We parked near the ceremony area, and the sound of the bass came in through the open doors. Distant cadence calls, gulls crying over the bay, an engine idling somewhere. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen and coffee from a concession stand. Frank got out first and stretched like he was arriving at his own award ceremony. He slapped the roof of the car once, loud. "Let's get pictures." 4 words, orders. He marched us toward the frogman statue, bronze muscles frozen in heroic strain. Families clustered around it, smiling, crying, holding phones up like offerings. Frank's face lit up as if he'd found a shrine. "Here," he said, planting himself beside the statue's base. He pulled my mother close to his side with an arm that looked affectionate from a distance and controlling up close. "Caleb goes here." 5 words, placing people like props. My brother wasn't there yet, still in prep, still in the pipeline's final minutes. But Frank posed anyway, practicing the image of himself next to victory. I stepped forward instinctively, into the edge of the frame, because I belonged to this family, even if my father acted like I didn't. Frank's arm shot out and stiff-armed my shoulder. Not hard enough to bruise, just firm enough to make a point. His palm pressed through my blouse like a stop sign. "Not you," he said. 2 words. I froze, then stepped back, controlled. The bronze statue's shadow fell across my shoes, and the salt air stung in my nose. Frank shoved his phone into my hands. "You take it." 3 words, assignment. My mother's eyes flicked to mine, apology drowning in them. Her beads clicked faster. She didn't speak. I took the phone. I framed them. I did what I'd always done, made sure everyone else looked good while I stood outside the picture. Frank adjusted his stance and smiled at an imaginary crowd. "People who served," he said, loud enough for nearby families to hear, "belong in the shot." 9 words, and he didn't flinch at the lie sitting between them. I lifted the phone and steadied it. The lens captured my father's proud grin, my mother's soft, strained smile, the bronze frogmen behind them. Heroism in metal, worship in flesh. I pressed the button. The shutter sound snapped like a small slap. And in my pocket, my scuffed ID pressed against my thigh. Hidden, silent, carrying the weight of a fleet and the ache of a daughter who had learned to disappear on command. I lowered the phone and handed it back. Frank didn't thank me. He checked the picture, nodded once, satisfied, and walked on as if I were just logistics for his glory tour. I followed, boots steady on the pavement, face calm, heart quiet in that dangerous way. Because the auditorium was next. And I knew exactly what Frank would do once he had a crowd. The first bite of smoked brisket tasted like pepper and ash. We'd barely stepped into the reception tent before the noise swallowed us. Plastic chairs scraping, kids chasing each other between tables, camera shutters snapping like tiny slaps. The air was thick with barbecue smoke and sunscreen, and the bay wind kept trying to lift the paper name tags off people's chests like it was tired of labels. Frank moved through it like a parade marshal. He clapped shoulders. He laughed too loud. He collected congratulations as if he'd personally passed Hell Week. My mother followed half a step behind him, rosary tucked in her hand like a secret. Her beads clicked softly when she thought no one was listening. I stayed where the tent's edge met the open air, one shoulder cool from the wind, my pocket warm from the scuffed ID pressed against my thigh. Frank spotted a group of old neighbors near the drinks cooler, men in polo shirts, women in sun hats, faces I'd known in the same way you knew wallpaper. He angled toward them immediately, chin lifted, ready to perform. "There he is," Mr. Miller boomed when he saw my father. "Frank Riley?" Frank's smile widened. "That's right," he said. "My boy made it." 5 words, as if Caleb was a trophy Frank had built with his own hands. Mr. Miller's wife leaned in, eyes bright. "And Claire?" she asked, scanning the group. "Where's your daughter? We heard she—" Frank cut her off fast. "She's here," he said, jerking his head toward me like he was pointing at a spare tire. "She helps." 4 words, a reduction. I stepped closer anyway, because disappearing was a habit, and habits had teeth. The tense shade cooled my face. I could smell burnt sauce on someone's plate and the sharp tang of lemonade. Mrs. Miller smiled at me politely. "Claire," she said, trying to place me in the memory she still owned. "What do you do these days?" Frank answered before I could. "She's a secretary," he said, and his tone made the word smaller than it was. "Some basement office. Makes coffee." 8 words. A lie with garnish. My mother's fingers tightened on her rosary. Click, click. I held my face still. "I serve," I said. 2 words. True. Safe. Frank snorted. "Paper service," he muttered. 2 words. Spit. Mr. Miller chuckled, taking the bait, relieved to have a joke. "Well, someone's got to do it," he said. I looked at my father. "I do my job," I said. 4 words, no apology. Frank leaned toward Mr. Miller, voice pitched for the group. "Caleb's the warrior," he said. "She likes air conditioning." 6 words. He smiled like he'd won. A woman beside the lemonade bucket squinted at me. "Didn't you drop out?" she asked. Frank's eyes lit up. This was his favorite story. 2 weeks, he said. "Couldn't hack it." 4 words. Clean, cruel. My chest stayed quiet, but inside I felt the old familiar pressure, like a hatch ceiling. I didn't correct her. Not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't hijack Caleb's day to heal my father's ego. So I chose the harder discipline. Silence. Frank waved toward the food line. "Come on," he said to me. "Get your plate." 4 words. Command. The volunteer at the tray line, an exhausted petty officer, slid food forward with gloved hands. I watched Frank receive ribs and brisket like he'd earned them. When my turn came, the volunteer offered me a burger that looked overcooked at the edges and a limp fistful of fries. Frank glanced at my plate and smirked. "Fits," he said. 1 word, the kind that left bruises. My mother's eyes flicked to mine, apology drowning in them again. She didn't speak. She never did. Not when Frank was in motion. I carried my plate to a table near the tent's outer pole and sat down where the wind could cool my hands. The burger smelled like char, the fries tasted like salt and surrender. Across the tent, my father held court, telling the same story in different sentences. My son is a warrior. My daughter is a footnote. I took one bite, then set the food down. Not because I couldn't eat, because swallowing felt like agreeing. A shadow fell over my table. A young lieutenant stood there, blonde, sharp uniform, eyes scanning my face with a kind of recognition that didn't belong at a family picnic. His gaze dropped briefly to my pocket like he could see through fabric. Then his spine stiffened with instinct. His hand started to rise. A salute. I caught it and stopped it with one small motion, 2 fingers lowering, subtle as a blink. Don't. His hand froze midair. His throat worked. He swallowed the word that was trying to leave his mouth. Ma'am, he said instead, too carefully. Good morning. 2 words that tried to be normal. I nodded once. Lieutenant? 1 word, controlled. His eyes flicked past me toward Frank, who was laughing loudly near the cooler. Something like disbelief crossed the lieutenant's face. Then he straightened and moved on, walking fast like the truth burned. Frank noticed the exchange and swaggered over, barbecue sauce on his napkin like war paint. What was that? He asked, eyes narrowed. 3 words. Suspicion. A lieutenant, I said. 2 words, nothing more. Frank scoffed. They salute anyone, he said. He thought you were somebody. 7 words. The insult hidden inside the joke. I held his gaze. I am, I said. 2 words, not loud. Frank's face tightened. Not here. 2 words, a muzzle. He walked away satisfied because he mistook my restraint for weakness. My mother came to my table then, slow, careful, like she was approaching a wounded animal. The rosary rested in her palm, beads damp from her grip. Eat something, she whispered. 2 words, pleading. I looked at her hands. Your fingers hurt, I said. 3 words. Gentle. She tried to smile. It didn't hold. Just today, she whispered. For Caleb. 4 words. A request wrapped in guilt. I nodded once. For Caleb, I said. 2 words. She touched my shoulder briefly, warm and shaking, then retreated back into Frank's orbit. The restroom trailer sat beyond the tent, white plastic and humming generators. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and cheap floral soap. The fluorescent light made everyone look tired. I washed my hands even though they weren't dirty because the water gave me something to listen to besides my own breathing. That's when I heard a voice behind me, low, certain. Admiral? 1 word. I turned. A woman stood near the paper towel dispenser, elegant in a way that didn't belong at a barbecue tent. Navy dress, pearl earrings, eyes sharp as a compass. She looked at me like she knew me, not as Frank's daughter, but as myself. Ma'am, I corrected softly, reflex. She smiled without humor. No, she said. Rear Admiral Claire Riley. 5 words. My pulse hit hard once, then settled into a controlled beat. Not here, I murmured. 2 words. A plea I rarely used. Her eyes flicked toward the door, understanding immediately. Your family doesn't know, she said. 5 words, not a question. No, I said. 1 word. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, Chas. Eleanor Harris, she said. Admiral Harris's wife. 4 words. I knew the name. Everyone in my world did. Her gaze softened, but her tone stayed steady. You built the deployment strategy, she said. You kept my husband's sailors alive. 11 words. Too many, but she didn't waste a syllable. I stared at her, the sink water running like a cover story. Please, I said. Don't. 1 word. My control cracking at the edge. She nodded once. I won't blow your cover, she said. 5 words. Then quieter, almost to herself. Strongest woman I know. 5 words. It hit me harder than Frank's insults because it wasn't inflated. It was accurate. I dried my hands with a paper towel that tore too easily. The paper felt thin, like my composure in that fluorescent light. Eleanor studied me for a beat longer, reading my posture, the tightness around my mouth, the way I kept my eyes forward like I was bracing for impact. Family can be loud, she said. 3 words. I met her gaze. And small, I said. 2 words. She didn't pity me, she simply nodded, as if she'd just confirmed a weather report. If you need an exit, she said, find me. 7 words. Then she left the restroom like she'd never been there, leaving behind the smell of disinfectant and a truth that warmed my chest in a way Frank never could. I walked past the tent and down toward the pier. The crowd noise faded behind me, replaced by gulls and the low slap of water against pilings. The wind off the bay smelled of salt and kelp, clean enough to sting. Gray ships sat out in the distance, calm and heavy, like they were thinking. I leaned on the railing and let my fingers find the rosary I carried now, the one my grandmother had left me, beads smooth from decades of prayer. It wasn't for show, it was for staying steady. I remembered the night I pinned on my first star. I'd stood in dress whites in a parking lot because the ceremony had ended and the seats labeled family had been empty. My father had mailed the tickets back with a note that said, "Paper pushers don't need applause." I'd eaten alone out of a cardboard box, the smell of fried food mixing with cold asphalt, and told myself it didn't matter. But standing on that pier, salt air in my lungs, it mattered in the quiet way things matter when no one is watching. 2 Super Hornets tore overhead, sudden and violent, their roar shaking the air like a language only I truly understood. The sound rolled across the water and faded into distance. I closed my eyes and let the vibrations settle my bones. I wasn't a photo assistant. I wasn't a critic. I was Rear Admiral Claire Riley. And I could endure one insecure old man for a few more hours because today wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about protecting Caleb's moment. I pushed off the railing and walked back toward the tent, the wind drying the salt on my lips. As I approached, I heard Frank's voice again, loud, proud, performing. "VIP seating," he said. "Front row family." 5 words. He was already claiming the best view. I slid my scuffed ID deeper into my pocket, felt the edge bite my thumb, and kept my face calm as I followed them toward the auditorium. Toward the place Frank loved most, a room full of witnesses. His hand reached for the VIP aisle seat, then stopped, as if the past could bite. The auditorium air hit me like warm plastic and stale popcorn. Inside, everything sounded amplified. Heels tapping on concrete, program pages snapping, a microphone popping as someone tested it. The bay wind couldn't reach in here. It was all bodies and anticipation, the kind of crowd energy that made fathers puff their chests and mothers press tissues into their palms. Frank walked ahead of us like he'd bought the building. "Front row," he said again, loud enough for 3 families to hear. Family deserves it. 5 words, and his tone made deserve sound like a rank. My mother followed with her rosary tucked in her fist, beads clicking softly against her wedding ring. Click, click, click. Each tiny sound felt like a prayer she couldn't say out loud. I stayed behind them, my scuffed ID pressing against my thigh. The bent corner rubbed my skin with every step, small, constant, like the reminder was alive. A petty officer with a clipboard stood near the aisle rope that separated VIP seating from general admission. He wore his khakis crisp, face set in professional neutrality. His eyes swept Frank, then my mother, then me. "Good morning," he said. "VIP list?" Frank didn't slow. "Riley," he said, like it should open doors. "My son's graduating." 7 words, pride already chewing on the room. The petty officer checked the clipboard. His pen paused. "I have a Riley," he said slowly, "but it's flagged." 2 words in my brain. Flagged. Frank's smile tightened. "Flagged," he repeated, offended. "We're family." 2 words, the same lie, reheated. The petty officer's gaze drifted past Frank, past his chest-out posture, toward me, cautious now. "Ma'am," he said softly, "are you—" Frank cut him off with a laugh that wasn't humor. "She's not VIP," he said. "She's just driving." 6 words. he said, just like a stamp. The petty officer's eyes narrowed a fraction, not rude, focused. Sir, he said, the flagged Riley is a flag officer. 8 words. My mother's rosary stopped clicking. Frank blinked once, hard. No, he snapped. No one in my family is... He stopped mid-sentence because the petty officer's gaze didn't move. It stayed on me, steady, like a compass settling. I felt my spine stiffen with instinct. I'd spent my life making myself small in this family. But in rooms like this, there were rules that didn't care what Frank wanted. I gave the petty officer a slight, controlled headshake. Not here. He swallowed and shifted into careful procedure. We have assigned seating, he said. General admission is to the right. Frank's face reddened at the edges. Assigned? He barked. My boy earned this. 5 words. And he meant himself. A few people nearby glanced over. The sound of the room thinned around us, the way it did when someone smelled trouble and wanted to watch without being seen watching. Frank tried to push past the rope. The petty officer stepped sideways, not aggressive, just present, a quiet wall. Sir, he said again, please. 1 word, a stop sign. Frank's laugh came out sharp. You're really going to block me? 6 words, loud. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Her rosary resumed. Click, click, click. Faster now. I leaned in slightly, keeping my voice low enough that only Frank and my mother could hear it. Dad, I said, sit anywhere for Caleb. 6 words. A plea I hated using. Frank turned on me like I'd betrayed him. Don't tell me where to sit. 7 words. He said it with the certainty of a man who had always been allowed to. He jabbed a finger toward the VIP row. That's ours. 2 words. Ownership, childish. The petty officer's posture tightened. Sir, if you continue... Frank snapped. If I continue what? Being his father? 8 words, now fully performing for the crowd. I watched him do it, the way he'd always done it. He made noise so other people would mistake volume for truth. A Master Chief appeared from the aisle like a shadow with authority. Broad shoulders, silver anchors, eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by ego. What's the issue? The Master Chief asked. 3 words. Calm. Final. Frank turned as if he'd been waiting for a bigger audience. They're denying us VIP, he said, because my daughter thinks she's important. 15 words, and he managed to make it my fault in one breath. The Master Chief looked at the petty officer, who murmured something low. The Master Chief's eyes shifted to me. Recognition flickered there, fast, professional, then restraint. I kept my face composed. I gave him the smallest nod. Not yet. He held the nod like he understood exactly what I was doing, containing a bomb until the right room, the right moment, the right witnesses. Sir, the Master Chief said to Frank, voice even, your family is welcome. Your seats are over there. 11 words, and he pointed to general admission. Frank's jaw tightened. I'm not sitting with... He stopped himself because he felt the room listening. He tried a new tactic. Lower voice, fake, calm. We're on the list, he said. Check again. 5 words, demand dressed as reason. The Master Chief didn't argue. He simply repeated, over there. 2 words, steal. Frank's eyes darted to my mother, then to me. He needed someone to fold, someone to make the world feel right again. My mother's shoulders sagged in surrender. She started to move toward the general seats without looking at me, rosary clicking like a small apology. Frank grabbed her elbow, not hard, but controlling. Mary, he hissed, don't. 2 words. A leash. I felt something cold settle inside me, not rage, resolution. Because I understood what this was truly about. Frank didn't care where we sat. Frank cared that, in front of a crowd, a uniformed professional had treated him like a regular man. And he couldn't stand that. So he looked at me and chose the only weapon he ever used when he was afraid. Humiliation. He raised his voice again. She's not even in, he said, pointing at me. She quit. 7 words, the lie he repeated until it sounded like history. A few heads turned fully now. A woman 2 rows over whispered something into her husband's ear. A kid stopped fidgeting and stared. The Master Chief's eyes narrowed just slightly. I kept my hands at my sides. I kept my shoulders squared. I didn't correct him. Not yet. Because correcting him here would be about me. And today, until the moment it wasn't, was about Caleb. The Master Chief stepped closer to Frank, lowering his voice, making it more dangerous than yelling. "Sir," he said, "you're disrupting a ceremony." 7 words. A warning with consequences. Frank's mouth opened, then closed. He hated being told no by men he couldn't bully. He swallowed, forced a smile, and turned it into a joke for the nearest audience. "Military's all bureaucracy," he said. "No respect." 5 words. Bitter. He released my mother's elbow and stomped toward the general section, shoulders stiff, pride dragging behind him like a broken flag. My mother followed, rosary moving again, slower now, marking time. I stayed a step behind them and slid into a seat at the end of the row, aisle side. The cushion smelled like old fabric and sunscreen. My scuffed ID pressed against my thigh like a held breath. Frank leaned forward, elbows on knees, scanning the front rows like he was plotting a land grab. "They think they can shame me," he muttered. 6 words. I didn't answer. The lights dimmed slightly. A microphone squealed, then settled. The stage screens flickered to life with a montage of training images, surf torture, log PT, sand everywhere. The crowd reacted with proud laughter and sniffed tears like pain was a family photo. Frank straightened as if the footage validated him. My mother clasped her rosary in both hands now, beads still. The announcer's voice boomed warmly. "Welcome, families." 2 words that sounded like mercy. As the ceremony began, a line of candidates appeared at the side aisle. Clean haircuts, rigid posture, faces carved by exhaustion and pride. The crowd surged with sound, then hushed again, a wave pulled back by discipline. My brother, Caleb, was third from the end. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, but his eyes were bright and steady. He scanned the crowd quickly. He found our section. His gaze landed on my mother first, soft, and then on Frank, tight, and then on me. For a half second, his eyes widened, just a flash of something like relief. Then he looked away, jaw setting, returning to formation. Frank didn't notice any of it. He was already standing, phone raised, trying to capture victory like it belonged to him. A protocol aide in khakis moved down the aisle toward our row, scanning faces. She stopped beside me, eyes flicking to my pocket, then up to my face. Her posture shifted into something careful and respectful. "Ma'am," she whispered, "command requests your presence backstage." 6 words. Frank snapped his head around. "What?" he barked. 1 word, suspicion and control colliding. The aide didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on me. "Now," she added softly. 1 word. My mother's fingers tightened around her beads. Click. Frank's face hardened. "Sit down," he hissed at me low. "Don't make this about you." 9 words. His deepest fear. I stood anyway, slow and calm. The seat cushion released a faint puff of stale air. I slid past my mother carefully without brushing her rosary. "I'll be back," I said to her. 4 words. Gentle. Frank reached for my wrist, fingers closing just enough to sting. His old habit of claiming control through touch. "Claire," he hissed. "No." 2 words. Panic. I looked down at his hand, then up at his eyes, and kept my voice low. "Let go," I said. 2 words. Not angry. Absolute. He froze because a few people nearby were watching now, sensing the private tension under public ceremony. He released me like he'd been burned. I followed the aide down the aisle, my steps quiet, controlled. Behind me, I felt Frank stare like a blade between my shoulder blades. At the stage door, the aide paused and handed me a small white card, backstage access. My name printed in clean black letters. Not guest, not helper. My name alone. I slid it into my palm, felt the smooth paper, and in my pocket, my scuffed ID pressed against my thigh like it knew the air was changing. Then the aide opened the door to the backstage hallway, and the sound of the crowd dropped away behind me, replaced by the sharp scent of coffee, sweat, and polished boots moving fast. Someone waited at the far end of the hall, posture rigid, uniform immaculate, and when he saw me, his hand rose, instinctively, into a salute he did not swallow. The salute snapped up so clean it felt like a sound. A lieutenant commander stood at the far end of the backstage hallway, posture locked, palm angled to his brow like a blade. The corridor smelled of burnt coffee and damp wool, families tracking cold air in on their coats, and the polished concrete under my boots carried every step like a whisper you couldn't erase. I paused, not because I didn't deserve it, because I didn't want it here. "Sir," I said softly. One word. A request, not a correction. His hand held the salute anyway, eyes steady, respectful. "Rear Admiral Riley." 3 words, no hesitation, no hiding. My throat tightened once, then I swallowed it down. I had swallowed worse in quieter rooms. "Not loud," I said. 2 words. He lowered his hand with the same precision he'd raised it. "Aye, ma'am." 2 words. Obedience without spectacle. The protocol aide who'd escorted me glanced between us, her expression smoothing into something practiced. "This way, ma'am," she said, and her tone carried the weight of a schedule that didn't bend for family drama. She guided me past stacked folding chairs and cable runs taped to the floor. A muffled cheer rolled through the wall from the auditorium as another montage hit the screen. The building vibrated faintly with it, a distant roar behind a locked door. We stopped at a small staging area where a handful of candidates stood in a tight line, still in formation even off stage, faces set, haircuts sharp, eyes bright with exhaustion and control. Their white uniforms looked almost too clean for the hell they'd just survived. Caleb was there. My brother. He stood with his jaw tight and his eyes forward, but when my shadow fell across the edge of his vision, he flicked his gaze to me for half a beat. That half beat held years. He didn't smile, he wasn't allowed to. But his eyes softened. Just slightly. Then he snapped back to forward focus, as if tenderness itself might break formation. A senior chief stood near them with a clipboard and a permanent scowl that had probably saved lives. He looked up, saw me, and his posture shifted into something careful. His hand started to rise. I stopped it with the same small motion. "Don't." He nodded once, absorbing the cue like a lesson. "Ma'am," he said quietly, respectful without noise. "Command's waiting." 3 words. The aide led me into a side room that smelled like printer paper and cologne. A portable rack held dress whites and garment bags. A small table was cluttered with programs and name cards. On the wall, a monitor showed the ceremony feed. My father's section visible in the wide shot, a block of faces watching heroism like entertainment. I spotted Frank immediately. Even from a grainy screen, he was loud. Standing when everyone else sat, phone raised, shoulders squared as if the ceremony owed him credit. My mother sat beside him, rosary hidden in her hands, head bowed just enough to look compliant. I looked away before the familiar ache could hook into my ribs. A door opened behind me, and the room's temperature seemed to drop a degree. A man stepped in with the calm weight of authority, khakis immaculate, hair silver at the temples, eyes sharp and tired in the way leaders' eyes often were. Beside him was a woman I recognized instantly from the restroom, Eleanor Harris, pearls catching the fluorescent light like quiet punctuation. The man offered his hand. "Rear Admiral Riley." 3 words, spoken like fact, not flattery. I shook his hand, firm. "Admiral," 1 word. His grip was brief and solid. "Thank you for coming." 4 words. "I came for Caleb," I said. 4 words. The only truth that mattered. He nodded once, reading the restraint in my posture. "We know," he said. "He requested you." 4 words. My chest went still. "Requested," I repeated. 1 word. Eleanor's gaze softened, almost imperceptible. "He insisted," she said. 2 words, simple. The Admiral gestured toward the table and the printed programs. "You're listed as the pinning officer." 8 words. For a second, the room narrowed to paper. I stared at the program stack, and the air smelled suddenly too sharp, fresh ink and plastic lamination. My fingers moved on their own, reaching, and the paper was warm from the printer like it had been born minutes ago. There it was. In bold, clean font that didn't care about my father's stories. Pinning officer, Rear Admiral Claire Riley. My name, my rank, no helper, no driver, no secretary. The title Frank had tried to crush under his boot at the gate, now printed for a room full of witnesses. I kept my face calm, but my pulse hit hard once like a knock from inside my sternum. I didn't approve this, I said. 4 words. Controlled. The Admiral's eyes held mine. Your brother did. 4 words. I felt something shift, small but permanent. Caleb had filled out the paperwork. He'd signed the request. He'd placed me where I belonged without asking permission from the man who tried to erase me. I exhaled slowly through my nose. He'll hate it, I said. 3 words. Eleanor's voice was quiet. He already hates your light. 5 words. Truth, gentle and sharp. The Admiral's tone stayed practical. We won't change it, he said. This is Caleb's moment. 9 words, and the emphasis landed where my heart already lived. Caleb. My throat tightened anyway. I don't want to steal focus, I said. 6 words. You won't, the Admiral replied. You'll honor his choice. 6 words. I looked down at the program again. The paper didn't tremble in my hands. I was proud of that. I was proud that my body didn't betray how much this mattered. Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. You can keep it dignified, she said. No speeches. 7 words. A gift. I nodded once. No speeches, I echoed. 2 words. The Admiral reached into a folder and slid a small card toward me, white, official, clipped with a lanyard. Backstage credential, my name printed clean. It felt smooth and cool under my fingertips. After the pinning, he said, we need 60 seconds. 7 words. For what? I asked. 2 words. He didn't answer directly. He glanced at the monitor showing the audience. Frank stood again, phone up, body angled to claim the moment. Because your father is escalating, the Admiral said. 5 words. I held his gaze. He always does, I said. 4 words. The Admiral's eyes narrowed slightly, not angry, resolved. Not on my deck, he said. 4 words. That sentence hit differently than comfort. It was boundary. It was protection that didn't require me to beg. The senior chief stuck his head into the room. 2 minutes, he said. 2 words. The Admiral nodded him away, then looked back at me. You ready? 2 words. I thought of the gate, plastic cracking under Frank's boot. I thought of the VIP rope and my mother's rosary clicking faster like a countdown to surrender. I thought of Caleb's eyes softening for half a beat, and how he had carried my name through training like a quiet promise. I'm steady, I said. 2 words. Eleanor's mouth curved slightly. Good, she said. 1 word. The aide opened the side door, and the sound from the auditorium rushed in. Applause, then silence, then applause again. Waves of emotion controlled by ceremony. We moved into the staging corridor. The air smelled of sweat and starch. Candidates stood in a tight line, shoulders squared. A chief checked uniform collars and whispered final instructions like prayers. Caleb was at the front now. He didn't look at me again, but I could feel him aware of me the way you felt the ocean before you saw it. The senior chief leaned in close to me. Ma'am, he murmured, you'll walk out when the announcer says your name. 10 words. I nodded once. Behind the curtain, the ceremony continued. The announcer's voice boomed through speakers, warm and practiced. Families, he said, thank you for your support. 4 words that made my mother's shoulders sink. Then the announcer began the pinning segment. My pulse tried to climb. I held it down. In. Out. Steady. The curtain edge shifted as a stagehand adjusted it. Light spilled through the gap, bright, white, theatrical. The senior chief touched my elbow briefly, guiding me to the mark. The tape on the floor was a thin strip of neon, absurdly simple for a moment this heavy. Across the gap, I could see the first rows. VIP seating, cameras, officers in dress whites, families in dark clothes, faces lifted. And there, 2 sections back from the front, Frank. He had maneuvered closer somehow, body angled like a wedge. He was half standing, phone held high, scanning for his son. He wasn't scanning for me. He never did. The announcer's voice shifted into formal cadence. "For today's pinning," he said, "we honor those chosen by the graduates." 8 words. The room hushed. A name was called. Another pinning officer walked out. Applause. A trident pinned. A hug. A wipe of tears. Then another. The process moved like a drumbeat. My hands stayed clasped at my waist. I could feel the scuffed ID in my pocket, the bent corner pressing into my thigh as if it wanted to be seen. My grandmother's rosary beads were wrapped around my fingers now, smooth and familiar, hidden beneath my palm. Salute, badge, beads. The senior chief glanced at me. "Next," he whispered. 1 word. The announcer's voice rose again, clear and public. "And for candidate Riley," he said, "pinning officer, Rear Admiral Claire Riley." 8 words. For a fraction of a second, time held its breath. Then I stepped forward into the light. The stage light hit my eyes like a flashbang. White, hot, and absolute. For a breath, I saw nothing but glare and floating dust lit like tiny sparks. The air smelled of hairspray, starch, and warm electronics. My boots found the taped mark on the floor, and the polished wood under me felt slick in a way sand never did. Then my vision cleared. Rows of faces rose out of the darkness. Families, officers, candidates' proud grief and joy stitched together into one wide, watching crowd. The flag at stage right stood perfectly still, bright under the lights, and the sight of it steadied my spine the way it always had. I felt the scuffed ID in my pocket like a pulse. I didn't look for my father. The announcer repeated my name for the room, and the microphone made it bigger than it had ever been in my house. "Rear Admiral Claire Riley." The words traveled. I saw the reaction begin in fragments. A commander in the front row stiffened, recognizing. A chief's hand rose halfway before he remembered he was seated. A woman's mouth parted in a small, surprised "oh." The sound of the room didn't swell into cheering. It dropped instead into a deep, collective pause. Silence. Thick, respectful, disbelieving, settled like a held breath. And inside that silence, I finally saw him. Frank was halfway out of his seat, phone frozen above his head. His face had the same shape it always did when he realized the world wouldn't obey him. Tight at the mouth, pale around the eyes, anger scrambling for a script. My mother sat beside him, rosary clutched in her fist. The beads didn't click now. They were still. Frank's lips moved. I couldn't hear the words through the room's hush, but I knew the flavor. Not her, not you, not today. The senior chief at the stage edge glanced toward Frank's row, then back to me, and his posture didn't change. It didn't have to. The building itself was holding the line. I kept my eyes forward. Caleb stepped onto the stage. My brother's white uniform looked carved from discipline, and his face was calm in the way only exhaustion could make you calm. He stopped in front of me and held his posture, chin level, eyes steady. For a second, we were 6 years old again, hiding behind our mother's laundry line during a thunderstorm, his hand in mine, both of us pretending we weren't scared. Then he spoke, barely moving his lips. "You came." 2 words. My throat tightened, but my voice stayed even. "Always." 1 word. The senior chief handed me the trident case. The velvet was cool under my fingers, and the metal inside looked too bright, too sharp for something that could change a life. The trident's edges caught the spotlight and flashed. Clean. Unforgiving. Caleb's gaze flicked toward the audience for half a heartbeat, toward our mother, then settled back on me. He'd chosen this, not Frank. Me. I opened the case and lifted the trident out carefully. The metal was heavier than it looked, a cold weight that felt like commitment. I stepped closer, close enough to smell the starch on his collar, and the faint salt on his skin that no shower ever fully removed after buds. My hands didn't shake. I pinned the trident to his chest. The clip snapped into place with a small final click that sounded louder than it should have. The trident sat there, bright against white fabric, a symbol earned the hard way. Caleb swallowed once, his jaw flexed. His eyes didn't water. Not yet. He didn't allow it. I leaned in just enough for him to hear me. I'm proud. 3 words. He breathed out through his nose, controlled. I know. 2 words. The silence broke, not into chaos, but into a wave of restrained sound as the room exhaled. Applause rolled through the auditorium like a tide, then steadied into something disciplined. A row of officers stood in unison near the front, khakis and whites rising at once. And then, as if the building itself remembered protocol, hands came up. Salute. Not for me. For the moment, for the rank. For the truth finally occupying space without apology. The sight hit my ribs like a physical thing. Years of being told to shrink, to hide, to not make it about me. And here were strangers honoring the title my father tried to grind into concrete. Behind that line of salutes, I saw Frank jerk fully upright. His phone dipped. His mouth opened. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't saluting. He was calculating how to steal a moment that didn't belong to him. He stepped into the aisle, pushing past knees and bags like urgency was entitlement. My mother reached for his sleeve, fingers tight. He shook her off. I watched from the stage as he moved, and something in my chest stayed cold and clear. He was going to try to get to the front. He was going to try to speak. He was going to try to claim Caleb's trident like a family heirloom Frank had forged in his own hands. The senior chief saw it too. So did the master chief from earlier. They moved without drama. 2 bodies in the right place at the right angle. Quiet walls that didn't need to raise voices. Frank made it 3 steps before the master chief blocked him at the cross aisle. Frank's face twisted. His voice rose, finally loud enough for nearby families to hear. That's my daughter! 3 words, ownership, not love. The master chief didn't budge. Sit down, sir. 3 words, Frank's jaw worked. She's a fraud. 3 words, desperation. A few heads turned. A few phones lowered. The applause faltered for a heartbeat, confused. Caleb's eyes shifted just slightly toward the disturbance. His shoulders stayed squared, but I saw the tension under the starch. I kept my posture steady and turned my gaze back to Caleb. This was his day, not Frank's theater. The announcer's voice carried on, professional, warm, refusing to feed the disruption. Names continued, tridents pinned, pride administered in measured doses. But Frank didn't stop. He leaned toward the master chief, spitting words that didn't belong in a room like this. She quit? 2 words, loud, wrong. The master chief's eyes narrowed. Enough. 1 word. Frank pointed toward the stage like he could reach me with a finger. She's stealing this. 3 words. My mother stood then, slow, trembling. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply lifted her rosary hand to her chest as if bracing herself. I saw her lips move, not a prayer for Frank, a prayer for the moment to survive. A protocol aide slipped down the aisle toward them, posture calm, and spoke low to my mother. My mother nodded once, tiny, then sat again, shoulders collapsing inward like she'd carried too much for too long. Frank tried to step around the master chief. He didn't get far. 2 more bodies arrived. Security in plain clothes. Expressionless. Not aggressive, just present. They guided him back with the kind of polite force that didn't invite negotiation. Frank's face flushed purple. He hissed something at the nearest guard, but the guard didn't change expression. The room's attention shifted, not toward Frank as a spectacle, but away from him as a contamination. And then the applause returned. Stronger, steadier, like the crowd had decided what mattered. Caleb stood in front of me with the trident on his chest, and for the first time his eyes flicked down to it, just a quick glance. A breath left him that sounded like relief. I leaned in again, voice low. He can't touch this. 4 words. Caleb's mouth tightened. I know. 2 words. The senior chief guided him toward the next mark. Ceremony moved on. The machine of recognition kept turning, grinding Frank's noise into irrelevance. But I could still feel Frank's gaze from the audience, hot, furious, searching for a crack. When the pinning segment ended, candidates formed up for the final salute. The crowd rose in waves. The flag's colors seemed brighter under the stage lights, almost sharp. Caleb turned his head a fraction toward our section. My mother was standing now, rosary held at her heart like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Small, real. Frank stood too, but his posture wasn't pride. It was wounded ego. He stared at me like he wanted the stage to burn. Caleb's eyes returned to mine for half a beat, and I saw the quiet question there. Are we safe? I answered without words, a small nod. Yes, because for once the room belonged to rules Frank couldn't bend. The announcer called the final recognition, and the candidates snapped into their last formation. Hands came up across the stage line, crisp, synchronized. I returned the salute. Steady. And in my pocket, the scuffed ID pressed against my thigh as if it finally had permission to exist. As the curtain began to close and the applause swelled again, I saw Frank twist in his row, scanning for a microphone, a staffer, any way to get his voice back into the air. His hand reached for the aisle, then stopped, like the whole auditorium had turned into a witness stand. The curtain dropped with a soft, final hush, and the backstage hallway swallowed the applause like a door closing on weather. The air back here smelled of sweat, starch, and burnt coffee. Boots moved fast on concrete. Chiefs barked small instructions that sounded like prayers disguised as orders. Caleb was guided away with the other new pins, faces still forward, shoulders still squared, while families flooded toward the exits like the building had opened a valve. I stayed near the sidewall, hands clasped, breathing controlled. In my pocket, the scuffed ID warmed against my thigh. A protocol aide touched my elbow again, gentle but firm. "Ma'am," she said, "this way." 2 words, and I followed. We moved through a narrow corridor into a glass-fronted office that looked down on the main concourse. The fluorescent light inside was too bright, clinical. A coffee stain ringed the edge of a paper cup on the desk. On the far wall, a small American flag stood in a holder, still and sharp. Admiral Harris was already inside, posture calm, eyes tired in the way they got when they'd spent a career putting out fires no one else could see. Eleanor stood beside him, pearls catching the light like quiet punctuation. A master chief waited near the door, arms folded, not threatening, just present. Harris gestured toward the glass. "Your father," he said. 2 words. I looked down into the concourse. Frank was cutting through the crowd like he was late to claim something. His face was red. His phone was up. He was talking loudly to anyone who would pretend to listen, pointing back toward the auditorium as if the stage had wronged him personally. My mother trailed behind him, rosary clenched so tight it looked painful. "He's telling people you impersonated a flag officer," Harris said. 9 words, calm as a weather report. I didn't blink. "He's scared." 2 words. Eleanor's voice was quiet. "He's also reckless." 3 words. Harris nodded once. "And he's disrupting a federal installation." 8 words, the kind that turned family drama into policy. I kept my shoulders squared. "What do you need from me?" 7 words, mission language. Harris held my gaze. "We need you to stay dignified," he said. "We'll handle him." 11 words. I believed him. That was the problem with leaders like Harris. When they promised, the world tended to obey. But I could see Frank's body language through the glass, the set of his shoulders, the aggressive tilt of his chin. He wasn't leaving quietly. He was hunting a microphone. A Payot table sat near the concourse center. Press passes, printed programs, a little stand-up sign that read media. Frank's eyes were already tracking it. I felt something cold settle behind my sternum. Not rage. Timing. "He'll try to get recorded," I said. 5 words. Harris's eyes narrowed. "Yes." 1 word. Eleanor stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. "If you speak," she said, "keep it surgical." 8 words. I nodded once. "I will." 2 words. The Master Chief by the door glanced at Harris. Harris gave a small nod. The door opened. and the sound of the concourse surged in, laughter, crying, camera shutters, the metallic squeak of stanchions being moved, the smell of sunscreen mixed with coffee and sweat, and the salty wind sneaking in every time someone opened an exterior door. We stepped out. People noticed. Not because I wanted them to, because rank did its own talking in certain rooms. Heads turned, conversations thinned. A few uniforms stiffened. A few hands started to rise, then stopped, remembering the setting, the crowd. Frank saw us. He froze, mid-step. For half a second, his face tried to decide which mask would work. Proud father? Offended victim? Righteous disciplinarian? Then his eyes locked on me, and the ugliest one won. "There!" he barked, loud enough to cut through the concourse. "That's her!" 3 words, ownership again. My mother flinched. Frank pushed toward us, jabbing a finger like it was a weapon. "She's lying," he shouted. "She quit!" 4 words, the lie he loved like oxygen. The crowd's movement slowed. Families didn't scatter. They watched. A few people with press badges angled their bodies toward him, instinctively smelling conflict. Someone lifted a phone. Frank's eyes brightened at the sight. He wanted this filmed. He wanted me trapped inside a clip. Harris didn't move fast. He didn't need to. He stepped forward, posture calm, voice even. "Sir," he said, "stop." 2 words. Frank turned toward him with instant contempt. "Who are you?" 3 words. Harris didn't answer with ego. He answered with reality. "This installation's command," he said. 3 words. Frank laughed too sharply. "Big deal," he said. "She's stealing my son's moment." 9 words, and he managed to make Caleb's achievement about Frank's humiliation. I felt Eleanor's steady presence beside me. I felt the Master Chief behind me like a door that wouldn't open. Frank lunged 1 step closer, eyes wild. "Show them your fake badge," he yelled. 5 words. I didn't reach for my pocket. I didn't produce my ID. Not yet. Because Frank wanted me to prove myself. He wanted me pleading for recognition. I kept my voice low and calm. "This isn't your stage," I said. 5 words. His face tightened. "It's my family." 3 words. I met his eyes without heat. "It's a Navy ceremony," I said. 4 words. He sneered. "Paper Navy." 2 words. Spit. Harris's voice stayed flat. "Sir, you are creating a disturbance," he said. "You will leave." 12 words. Frank's jaw worked. He glanced around, saw the uniforms, the watchful faces, the press badges, and realized force wouldn't work. So he shifted to poison. He turned his head slightly, projecting to the crowd. "She's ashamed of us," he announced. "She hides behind rank." 9 words. My mother's rosary clicked once, sharp and involuntary. I felt the scuffed ID press into my thigh like a pulse demanding to be heard. Eleanor leaned in, barely moving her lips. "Now," she murmured. 1 word. I reached into my pocket and pulled the ID out, not with flair, not held high like a trophy. I held it at my side, then offered it to Harris. Harris didn't glance down like it was a card. He looked at it like it was an identity the base already knew. Then he raised his voice just enough for the nearest circle to hear. "Rear Admiral Riley is here at her brother's request," he said. 12 words. The crowd's air changed. A few uniforms snapped straighter. A few civilians looked confused, then embarrassed, then quietly impressed as the meaning caught up. Frank's face went pale at the edges. He stepped toward Harris, hands half raised like he was about to snatch the ID. "That's not—" Harris didn't let him finish. "Do not touch her," he said. 4 words. Frank's hands stopped in the air. The Master Chief shifted 1 step forward, the kind of movement that didn't threaten, but promised. Frank tried again, voice cracking with fury. "She's my daughter!" 4 words. I spoke softly, and my words cut cleaner than yelling ever could. "You stepped on my ID," I said. The Navy still stood. 12 words. The payoff line landed like a quiet gavel. A beat of silence rippled outward, people absorbing the image, a boot on plastic at the gate, a daughter erased by pride, a rank that didn't beg to exist. Then, without prompting, a chief near the stanchions lifted his hand in a crisp salute. Another followed, then another. Salute moved through the nearest uniforms like a controlled wave, respect not for drama, but for dignity that refused to bend. Frank looked around as if the room had turned its back on him. He swallowed hard, eyes darting for an ally, a laugh, a witness willing to say, "It's just family." No one did. Harris's voice stayed even. "Sir, you will exit the concourse," he said. "Now." 9 words. Frank's nostrils flared. He turned toward my mother as if she could restore his dominance. "Mary," he snapped, "tell them." 2 words. My mother's hands trembled around the rosary. Her lips parted. For a second, I thought she'd fold again, offer him her silence like a shield. But she didn't look at Frank. She looked at me, and something in her face, tired, ashamed, brave in a late way, shifted. "No," she whispered. 1 word. "Small. Earthquake." Frank froze. "What?" 1 word. "Shock." My mother's voice shook, but it held. "No," she repeated, louder this time. "You stop." 3 words. Frank stared at her like he'd never seen her stand upright before. The Master Chief stepped in, gentle and firm. "Sir," he said, "this way." 2 words. Frank's pride fought for one last breath. "This is insane," he spat. 3 words. Harris didn't blink. "It's policy," he said. 2 words. Cold. Frank stumbled backward, not physically, socially. His power had been oxygen. The room had stopped feeding it. He turned, jaw clenched, and walked toward the exit with stiff steps that tried to look dignified. 2 base security staff walked beside him, not grabbing, just guiding. My mother didn't follow. She stood where she was, rosary at her chest, eyes wet. As Frank disappeared through the doors, the bay wind rushed in. Salt and kelp and diesel, clean air replacing his cologne. The crowd began to move again, slowly, as if everyone needed a second to remember why they were here. Eleanor touched my elbow lightly. "You kept it clean," she said. 4 words. I nodded once. "For Caleb," I said. 2 words. Harris's gaze held mine. "He'll be in the family area in 5, he said. 8 words. I inhaled, slow. The ID in my hand was still scuffed, still bent at the corner. But now it was visible. Now it was allowed. I slid it back into my pocket, felt it warm against my thigh again, and started walking toward the family area, toward my brother, toward the quiet part of the day Frank couldn't steal. Behind me, my mother's rosary beads clicked once, soft, steady, like a new kind of counting. And ahead, through the moving crowd, I saw the white blur of Caleb's uniform turning toward me as if he'd sensed the air change. Caleb found me before I found him. He moved through the family area in his whites, like the crowd parted out of instinct. New trident on his chest, catching the light every time he turned. The air smelled like sunscreen and salt and sweat scrubbed clean too late. And the noise around us was a messy mix of laughter and crying and cameras trying to trap a moment that refused to sit still. My brother's eyes locked on mine. He didn't smile wide. He didn't rush. He walked with the same controlled pace the pipeline had carved into him, discipline even in joy. When he reached me, he stopped close enough that I could see the faint redness at his collarbone from the pin and the tired brightness behind his eyes. He exhaled once, like he'd been holding it all day. "You okay?" 2 words. I nodded, slow. "I'm steady." 2 words. He looked down at my pocket, just a flick of his gaze, like he could feel the scuffed ID through the fabric. Then he looked back up, and his jaw tightened in a way that wasn't anger. It was promise. "I heard," he said. 1 word, heavy. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't have to. He turned his head slightly and scanned behind me. My mother stood a few steps back, rosary pressed to her chest like a shield she'd finally learned to hold outward instead of inward. Her eyes were wet. Her mouth trembled at the edges, trying to smile and failing and trying again. Caleb's expression softened. He stepped past me and reached for her first. My mother made a small sound, half sob, half laugh, and pressed her face into his shoulder, beads clicking softly against his uniform. Click, 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 like the prayer finally found a place to land. Caleb held her for one full breath, then released her gently because he knew what attention did to her. He turned back to me. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. I kept my voice low. "You chose me." 3 words. His eyes flickered, gratitude, then something harder. "I did." 2 words. A crowd pushed closer as people recognized him, eager for photos, eager for their own proof of survival. Caleb didn't flinch, but his shoulders tightened slightly, and I felt the familiar instinct rise in me. Protect the mission. Eleanor Harris appeared at the edge of the group like she belonged there by right. She didn't touch my arm this time. She just met my eyes and gave the smallest nod. "Exit when you need." I nodded back. Caleb leaned in toward me, voice barely moving. "Walk with me." 3 words. I stepped beside him and we moved through the crowd toward a quieter corridor near the side doors. The sound softened behind us, muffled by walls, and the cooler bay air crept in through a cracked exterior door, salt and kelp, clean and sharp. Caleb stopped in the shadow of a bulletin board covered in laminated base notices. The fluorescent light here was duller, kinder. He turned fully toward me, posture still straight, but his face finally allowed something human. "He did it again," he said. 4 words. I didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. 1 word. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "At the gate?" 2 words. I nodded once. "He stepped on it?" 4 words. His jaw flexed like he wanted to bite through anger. Then he did what SEAL training had taught him. He swallowed it into focus. "I tried," he said, "to stop him." 4 words. "I know," I replied. 2 words. He glanced down at his trident like he was grounding himself in the weight of it. Then he looked back up. "I put your name down," he said, "on purpose." 6 words. My throat tightened once, quick and clean. "I saw." 2 words. Caleb breathed out slowly. "He kept calling you nothing." 5 words, quiet. I held Caleb's gaze and kept my voice steady. "I never was." 3 words. That earned the smallest shift in his face, relief, like the line he'd needed finally arrived. He nodded once. "Good." 1 word. We stood there for a moment, listening to the distant roar of families and the faint slap of flags outside against poles in the wind. My hand found the rosary beads wrapped around my fingers, smooth, familiar, and I realized my grip had loosened. Caleb's voice dropped. "He say anything else?" 4 words. I could have given him every insult, every lie, every cut Frank tried to lodge in public. Instead, I chose the only thing worth carrying forward. He wanted me invisible. 4 words. Caleb's eyes hardened. "Not today." 2 words. Footsteps approached, careful, tentative. My mother came into the corridor slowly, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to enter a space where men weren't loud. Her rosary hung from her hand now, beads swaying slightly with each step, catching the overhead light like small, dull pearls. She stopped in front of us, lips trembling. "Caleb," she whispered, "I'm so proud." 5 words. Caleb nodded once, gentle. "I know, Mom." 3 words. Her gaze shifted to me. She looked at my face like she was seeing the cost of her silence in real time. Her throat worked. "I said no," she whispered. 3 words, like she was confessing and begging and celebrating all at once. I held her eyes. "I heard." 2 words. She swallowed hard. "I should have." 2 words died. I didn't let her finish the sentence that would turn into years of self-punishment. My voice stayed low, controlled. "You stood today." 3 words. Her eyes filled fully then. She clutched the rosary tighter. "I'm sorry," she said. 2 words. Raw. I nodded once. "I know." 2 words. Not forgiveness as a ribbon, acknowledgement as truth. Behind her, the exterior door opened briefly and wind rushed in, carrying a burst of salt air and distant gull cries. Somewhere outside, someone laughed in relief, the kind of laugh that came after surviving a day you didn't think you could survive. Caleb looked between us like he was measuring the moment the way he'd measure a tide, watching for danger, watching for strength. Then he spoke quietly. "We go eat?" 3 words. It wasn't small. It was sacred, an ordinary thing offered after a storm. My mother let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Yes," she said. 1 word. I nodded. "Yes." 1 word. We walked back out together. The family area had shifted while we'd been gone. The crowd still buzzed, but the attention had moved on because crowds always did. What stayed was what mattered. Caleb's trident, my mother's rosary, my own steadiness. A few uniforms passed us and offered small nods, careful not to turn respect into spectacle. One chief glanced at me and lifted his hand halfway, then stopped, remembering the setting. He settled for a firm nod instead. I returned it. My father wasn't there. The absence felt strange for half a beat, like your ears adjusting when a constant noise suddenly stops. Then it felt like air. We found a table near the edge of the tent where the wind could move through. The smell of barbecue smoke hung low, but the salt air cut it clean. Caleb sat between my mother and me like a living boundary. He picked up a water bottle and drank slowly, as if even hydration needed discipline. Then he looked at me over the rim. "You staying?" 2 words. I knew what he meant. In town, near them, inside the orbit where Frank had ruled for decades. I shook my head slightly. "I go back tonight." 4 words. Caleb nodded once, accepting. "Good." 1 word. My mother's fingers traced one bead, then another. "Will he?" She started and stopped. I answered without heat. "He'll be loud." 3 words. Caleb's gaze didn't waver. "Not on my day," he said. 4 words. A small smile tugged at my mother's mouth, fragile but real. She looked at Caleb like he'd just spoken a miracle into existence. I reached into my pocket then and pulled out the scuffed ID. The plastic was scratched, corner bent, still carrying the faint gray smear from my father's boot. I placed it on the table between my plate and Caleb's water bottle. My mother stared at it like it was a bruise made visible. Caleb looked at it, eyes narrowing. "He did that?" 3 words. I nodded once and, "At the gate." 3 words. Caleb's hand hovered, then he didn't touch it. Instead, he placed his fingers lightly on the edge of the table beside it, like a promise without possession. "We keep it," he said. 2 words. I met his eyes. I did. 2 words. He nodded again, satisfied. "Good." 1 word. We ate quietly. Barbecue that tasted like smoke and pepper, bread that stuck to my teeth, lemonade sharp enough to wake you up. The wind brushed my cheek once, cool and clean, and I realized my shoulders had dropped without me noticing. At the end, Caleb stood and pulled his mother into one more tight hug. Her rosary clicked against his trident this time. Beads and metal, prayer and proof. Then he turned to me. For a second, he hesitated, like he didn't know how to touch this part of our history. Me leaving, him staying, both of us surviving different wars. So I made it simple. I opened my arms. He stepped in and hugged me hard. Brief, controlled, but real. His uniform smelled like starch and salt. He leaned close enough to whisper, "You're not the critic." 4 words. I held him steady. Never was. 2 words. When we pulled apart, he gave me the smallest nod, the kind that meant I see you in a language our father never learned. I picked up my ID and slid it back into my pocket where it belonged. Not hidden, not buried, carried. My mother walked with me toward the parking lot as the sun dropped lower, light turning the bay into a flat sheet of silver. She held her rosary loosely now, beads no longer biting her palm. At my car, she stopped, eyes wet again. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. 4 words. Late, but true. I nodded once, and I know. 2 words. She reached out and touched my cheek lightly, warm, trembling, then pulled back as if she didn't trust herself to hold on. I opened the door and paused. Mom, I said. 1 word, she looked up. Keep saying no, I said. 3 words. Her chin quivered. Then she nodded. Once, firm. I will. 2 words. I got in, started the engine, and let it idle a moment, steady hum, the kind of sound that promised motion forward. My ID pressed against my thigh, warm now. My grandmother's rosary rested in my palm, smooth as a vow. I didn't look back for Frank. I looked forward for Caleb. And as I drove out past the gate, floodlights blooming behind me, I understood the quiet lesson the day had carved into bone. Honor doesn't ask permission.